Good morning. I'm Bill Bernet. I'm a forensic psychiatrist and a child psychiatrist in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm really happy to join this conference today, which has the interesting theme of alienation, the truth regarding the trauma and abuse. And the particular topic that I'm presenting fits into that theme. The name of my topic is Truth or Consequences: Strategies for Addressing the Epidemic of Parental Alienation Misinformation. So I'm going to cover three different areas. So I'm just going to tell you ahead of time what the plan is. First of all, we all know that there's been an amazing or remarkable amount of misinformation published regarding parental alienation. It's very distressing how much fake news or misinformation is published. Second, I want to give you some examples of how we have corrected this information. At times it's been good, sometimes the results have not been so good. And finally, I want to go over some action items that we can all use, you and me and other people can use to address this information. So what does this have to do with the title, Truth or Consequences? So I think it fits in like this. You know, the truth is there's a lot said about parental alienation, and some of it's wrong. And we're really concerned that the truth has to be validated. And then the idea of consequences is that we need to do something when the truth is violated. There's something we need to do. We need to have consequences for what to do when the truth is lacking. So that's what I mean by truth or consequences. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to give you a number of examples of times that we have refuted something that's been printed or stated about parental alienation. And some of these results are good. At times we've had really successful outcomes. At other times, not so good. So I think it's important to hear both sides of results. Let's start with this book called Family Evaluation in Custody Litigation. This book was published a few years ago by the American Psychological Association. Actually, this is the second edition. The first edition was pretty good. We didn't really have any objections to the first edition, but the second edition added a chapter an introductory chapter in the very beginning that says inaccurate and negative things about parental alienation. So here's an example of what it says in that chapter. We can read this together. PAS further assumes that a child's strong alignment with one parent while rejecting a relationship with the other parent is without legitimate justification, including situations in which there is child abuse. So this was a paragraph in that objectionable chapter in that book. Then what's wrong with this? Well, first of all, the idea that we assume that the contact refusal is without legitimate justification. And secondly, that we even do it when there's child abuse. Both of those statements, those clauses are wrong. We don't do either one of those. And so this was corrected. In this case, I sent a complaint to the American Psychological Association. It went up and eventually to the general counsel, who's the attorney for the organization. And she got back to me and we had a dialogue back and forth. And eventually they revised that text to make it correct. This is the revised text. The concept of PAS assumes that a child's strong alignment with one parent and rejection of the other is often without legitimate justification. In other words, often rather than always. And secondly, the second sentence is also correct. Supporters of this concept and syndrome state that its use should be excluded if the child was neglected or abused by that parent. So that's a simple example where a book was published, we complained about it, and the text was revised in that book. So here's another example that you may have heard of. A couple of these are from several years ago, and you may have heard some of these, but I'm going to get into more recent examples in a minute. So this is something that happened in the United States Congress, that the House of Representatives was passing or considering a resolution for them to vote on. The resolution isn't a bill or a law. It's simply a resolution is the statement of an opinion of the Congress. And the original text of this resolution was, whereas scientifically unsound theories such as parental alienation syndrome, enmeshment, and others are frequently applied to reject parents and children's reports of abuse and so on. Well, that's an extremely pejorative comment to make about parental alienation. And so we complained about that. Some of us went and visited the congressman in the we went to the Capitol building and to the office building for the House of Representatives, and we talked to the staff of the particular congressman who was promoting this resolution. And they understood what we were concerned about, and they corrected it. They removed the objectionable phrases. And what was eventually passed by the House of Representatives was the following, that this is the objectionable part. And then what was revised and passed was simpler, which said, whereas scientifically unsound theories are frequently applied, and so on. So we got rid of the negative statement about parental alienation. So those are a couple of simple examples. I'm going to give you some more examples that occurred in journals. So this is a really good journal called the Journal of Forensic Sciences. And in the next slide, you can see that a few years ago, my colleagues and I published an important article about parental acceptance rejection questionnaire and its use in evaluating these children. And 2 days after our article was published, this doctor from Tunisia, whose name is Vincenzo Pupo, contacted the journal and complained and wrote a lengthy letter complaining about our article. Well, the editor did a good thing. The editor contacted me and asked me if I wanted to reply to that letter to the editor, which I did, of course. And this is what we ended up doing. So this was a nice way to do it. In this case, the letter to the editor by Dr. Pupo and the response from me was published back to back in the same issue of the journal. And of course, I took this opportunity to explain parental alienation, and my explanation was even longer than the original letter to the editor. So I tried to make use of that letter in order to propagate our own ideas. This is another example where the original problematic article and the response were both published together. So this is in this journal called Family Trauma, Child Custody, and Child Development. And the same thing happened. Like in this case, this doctor, whose name is Jean Mercer, wrote an article about the same thing, about that previous article that we published regarding the Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire, the PARQ. And she complained about it. And the editor of the journal got in touch with me and my colleagues and asked us if we wanted to publish a reply, which we did. So this was our reply. And they did the same thing, in that the problematic complaining article by Dr. Mercer and the response by me and our colleagues were all published back to back in the same issue of that journal. So that's a good way to reply to misinformation that's published in a professional journal. I'm going to give you a few more examples. This one is simpler. This is a good journal that has published a number of articles about parental alienation called Children and Youth Services Review. And in this case, they published an article by some psychologists from Portugal. It was actually a very good article. And the article is not antagonistic toward parental alienation. Actually, it is very favorable toward parental alienation. And it's a literature review called Empirical Research on Parental Alienation. And the article is comprehensive and it's very positive, except it does have one sentence in it which was a problem, and that the authors of this article from Portugal quoted a reference to that Dr. Jean Mercer, which the reference said something that was incorrect. And this is the sentence from the article. As Mercer recently pointed out, there is an error of logic in the assumption that the child's resistance or contact refusal is always the result of the manipulation or persuasion of the preferred parent, who influences the child to avoid the non-preferred parent. So what's wrong with that statement by Mercer? The statement by Mercer is incorrect, that people who promote parental alienation do not say, we would never say, that contact refusal is always the result of alienating behaviors by the preferred parent. As we've said many, many times, there are many possible causes for contact refusal. And this statement by Jean Mercer is incorrect. But this statement was quoted in this article that otherwise is very, very good by Dr. Marquez and her colleagues. So we got in touch with her and with the editor of the journal, and they agreed to correct it. So this was a simple thing. In this case, they simply deleted the sentence in that article. Of course, they can't delete the hard copy of the journal, but they can delete the digital copy that's posted online and will be looked at, years from now. And that's good to get that straightened out. Here's another situation that involved the very same journal. We were talking about this journal called Children and Youth Services Review, which in fact has published some really good articles about parental alienation. But in one case, they published a problematic article. And this was it. This is an article by a couple of psychologists from Spain. And you can see the title. It says, Obey the Justice System or Protect Children, the Moral Dilemma Posed by False Parental Alienation Syndrome. So these psychologists from Spain had all sorts of criticisms about parental alienation theory. Most of them were totally wrong, and they misrepresented parental alienation theory. So in this case, we didn't know about this article until after it was published. But once it was published, we contacted the journal editor, and he agreed for us to write a response. So in this case, my colleagues, Maria Cristina Verrocchio, who's from Italy, and Stan Carosi, who's from Australia, and I wrote a response. And it was published a few months later in the same journal. So that's also a good way to deal with this, especially in a professional journal, that we don't want to let a really bad article stand and be read endlessly by other people. We want to be able to refute it and have a response. Now, if you're not familiar with the way these journals work, let me explain something about this kind of rebuttal. That if you go online and you locate the original article by Clemente and Padilla Raciro, which is an objectionable article, and you can find it in the website for that journal, Children and Youth Services Review, and you can pull it up, and you can either see the abstract or you might be able to see the entire article. In either case, there will be a notation saying that there's a follow-up to this article, and it's by Bernet, Verrocchio, and Carosi. In other words, the original article will be a notation uh, advising the reader that there's another article that goes along with it. And the same thing is true. I gave you the example of where a correction was made. An article was published and a correction was made. So the same thing happens there, that in the online version, where the original article is posted, there'll be a notation that there was a correction made, and then the correct version of the article is posted. So what I'm trying to explain is that when we try to make these corrections, they're not lost to readers in the future, that there's a system for connecting the correction up with the original article that had the misinformation. So this is interesting. This is in a journal, the American Journal of Family Therapy, that over the years has published many, many articles about parental alienation. But in this instance, the journal published a negative article, which is by the same person that I was just telling you about. I was describing an article by this psychologist, Miguel Clemente, who's in Spain, and he wrote that previous problematic article where we wrote a response. So here he is again. This is in a different journal, the American Journal of Family Therapy, and it's a similar article that makes a number of false statements regarding parental alienation. So in this case, my colleagues did the same thing. In this case, Amy Baker, Linda Gottlieb, and Maria Cristina Verrocchio wrote a response, and it was also published, not in the same issue, but subsequently in the American Journal of Family Therapy. So I guess what I'm trying to get across, there are many, many examples of how we have done this. I'm trying to set a good example of what other people might want to do in the future. Okay, here's another example of a journal that I'm very familiar with, the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. This is the organization which is called AAPL, A-A-P-L, the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, and this is their journal. So in this case, here's an article that was written by somebody I know, Timothy Huchin, and the name of it was "The Parental Alienation Debate Belongs in the Courtroom, Not in DSM-5." This was a few years ago. This was when we were trying to get parental alienation to be included in the DSM. And I didn't know about this article either until after it was already published. And once I saw it, I contacted the editor and said, we would like to do a response. So Dr. Amy Baker and I put together a response. Let me say something about the actual article. In the article, it's really offensive, and it has what we would call an ad hominem attack, in that it says very negative things about people who are interested in parental alienation. And this is not a very good, it's not a very professional way to discuss a topic. For instance, the objectionable article said, one must examine the possible financial motivations that may influence the positions of those engaged in debate. To get a good sense of PAS's support, one has only to follow the money trail. And they also said, a formal diagnosis of PAS with the obligatory dueling experts testifying at a custody hearing can become a prime source of fee generation. So that's a pretty underhanded criticism of people who are interested in the topic of parental alienation. But what happened was Dr. Baker and I did write a response to that article, and it was published in the same journal, not in the same issue, of course, but a few months later. So here's an example that is not from a journal, a professional journal, but this is from a magazine. And Forbes magazine is a very well-known mainline magazine, which has to do with investing and finances. But they also have columns and blogs by people who are writing about topics that don't have to do with financial issues. For instance, there is one of their writers. Her name is Patricia Firsch, and she wrote a blog or an essay on the Forbes website that was objectionable. And you can tell just from the name of it. Parental alienation as a defense to allegations of domestic violence and allegations of child sexual abuse. So you can see how she's making the argument that parental alienation is not a legitimate topic, but it's only used to get perpetrators of domestic violence out of trouble. So a number of us contacted the editor of Forbes magazine and also contacted Ms. Firsch. And she actually responded in a rather nice way, saying that she wasn't really too familiar with parental alienation, but she seemed interested in learning more about it. So in fact, a few months later, she wrote a new article, which was actually pretty positive. And the name of the new article was Parental Alienation, Who Does This? And it had to do with the personality types of alienating parents. So that was a good outcome in that case, our correspondence with the author herself and the editor seemed to help to educate the author about this topic. So I guess that's our ultimate goal, is to try to not just post a rebuttal, but to educate people who write about this to be more correct and understand the topic better. So there are different kinds of outcomes. Sometimes there's a new an article. Sometimes there's a letter to the editor. That is the response. Sometimes the author herself might write a new article. So here's a really, really big example that only happened a couple of months ago and is still going on to some extent. So a couple of months ago, this report was submitted to the United Nations. And in particular, one of the components of the United Nations is the Human Rights Council. And they had arranged for a consultant whose name is Dr. Raim Al-Salam to investigate complaints that related to violence against women. So after conducting an investigation, Dr. Al-Salam submitted this report to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And if you look at this this image, you can see it towards the bottom. It says, the name of this is Report of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Its Causes and Consequences. And then her name, Raim Al-Salam. The problem is that this report, which was posted on the website of the Human Rights Council and is still there, has hundreds of false statements regarding parental alienation theory. Even though the initial topic seemed to be domestic violence, the report almost completely pertains to criticisms of parental alienation. We were very concerned that this had been submitted to a component of the United Nations, and we were very concerned that it would be accepted and endorsed by the Human Rights Council. But fortunately, that has not happened. Several of us got together and wrote this analysis of the report of the Special Rapporteur. So this is a booklet which goes into detail, sort of paragraph by paragraph, criticizing the report that is on the website of the United Nations. Incidentally, this is easy to get. If you take down the name of this, analysis of the report of the Special Rapporteur, and Google it, it pops up because it's posted in various places. Or if you want it, if you're not able to find it, just send me an email and I'll send you the link to this document. It's really interesting because it's a detailed critique of the document that was submitted to the United Nations. So what did we do with this? We sent it to dozens of people. That the Human Rights Council has about 30 delegates on it who come from different countries. And so we sent our analysis to all of those individuals. We sent the analysis to the representatives of those countries to the United Nations, to the president of the Human Rights Council, and other people. So we tried to distribute our analysis as widely as we could. And what we wanted them to do was to not endorse the report of the Special Rapporteur. So far, we appear to have been successful. And that so far, as of today, when we're putting this video together, the Human Rights Council has not endorsed that report. However, it is still posted on the website of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. So we would like to get it removed. We're not totally out of the clear because it's still possible, of course, that the topic might come up again when they have a meeting and perhaps they will take further action. But that's a good example where we're dealing with a very important government, or beyond, beyond government, the United Nations organization. And it's really important for us to try to suppress misinformation that they are making available to the public. So if you're interested, track this down, take a look at it, and see what you think about it. Okay, I'm still talking about successes. And here's a couple of successes with another journal called Family Court Review. As you may know, this is a really important family law journal that's published by the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, AFCC. Family Court Review over the years has published many articles about parental alienation and related topics, but a few of them were problematic. For instance, here are some articles over a number of years that made false statements or misinformation regarding parental alienation. And I made a list of them, and I contacted the editors of the journal, that is the Family Court Review, and they agreed that if I want to, I can submit a new article explaining the history of the information, of the misinformation, and what happened over a period of several years. So that's a pretty good response, and that they're not going to remove these articles from publication, because it's not as though the entire articles were mistaken, that each article had one or two paragraphs that were problematic. So I thought that was a good solution. They invited us to send in our own article, which I think has a good chance of being published. So that journal has been pretty responsive. And I can give you one more example from Family Court Review where they seem to be very responsive. In this case, somebody I know submitted an article to the Family Court Review for them to consider. And I found out about it. And I knew that the article was very problematic, even though it had never been published. We knew about it, and we had a copy of it, a copy of the manuscript. And I once again contacted the editors of this journal, and they knew about the article too, and they agreed to not publish it. They said that they would send it back to the author, and they would ask for certain changes before they would consider publishing. So that's one final example where we intervened, and we apparently we prevented something from being published that would have been very problematic. So this has been going on for years. This is sort of an unusual feature of parental alienation theory, and that so much misinformation is published that has required so much correction over many, many examples over many years. And this is an example that goes way, way back, more than 20 years, to something that Richard Gardner wrote. Even in his time before he died, there had been many articles that had false information about him. So he tried to refute them as a group, and he wrote an article that summarized the misinformation and was published in the American Journal of Family Therapy. And that article was Misinformation versus Facts about the contributions of Richard A. Gardner. And you can look this up if you're interested. But even then, he put a lot of effort into refuting misinformation. He has a little quote here at the bottom, which is interesting, from Arthur Schopenhauer. Truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Secondly, it is violently opposed. Thirdly, it is accepted as self-evident. And we seem to be going through those stages with regard to parental alienation theory. So I've been talking about examples of correcting misinformation that has had pretty good results. But I also want to tell you about several examples where the results were not so good. So here's an example that did not work out. This was a book published in Sweden several years ago by a very important publisher called Norstedts Juridik. It's a big publishing company in Stockholm that publishes books having to do with the law. And this particular book had some discussion of parental alienation theory. And it had this comment here about Richard Gardner. It referred to parental alienation theory launched by American child psychiatrist Richard Gardner, and then in parentheses, an adherent of pedophilia. Well, that's a false statement about Dr. Gardner. Actually, in that article I just showed you, he himself refuted the idea that he was an adherent of pedophilia. I mean, there's a long history to this, and he did talk about pedophilia in some of the things he wrote about, but he certainly was not a proponent of pedophilia. And in one of his papers, he said that he thought pedophilia was a crime, and that individuals who are found to have committed that crime should be in prison. So how does this publisher get away with saying this? So in this case, Demosthenes Orandos and I wrote to the publisher and also to the university that was the basis, the home of the person who wrote this book chapter, whose name was Christian Deason. So we did as much complaining as we could, and we did not have any success. So this is what they said. This is what the publishing company said. We conclude that the statement in the book falls within the Swedish freedom of expression to publish the views expressed by the authors of the book. So what they're saying is that in Sweden, and I think this is also true of the United States, that you can express almost any opinion what you want. If you say it's your opinion, you can say things even which are false and which are objectionable. And the people from the university said the same thing. They said the reported text message about Gardner being interested in pedophilia was neither the result of a dishonest inclusion nor exclusion of data or material, but the opinion of the author. In other words, they're saying that it's a problem if an author misquotes a person or presents material that is incorrect. That's a problem. But if an author is simply expressing an opinion, they can say just about whatever they want. So we didn't get anywhere with that complaint, but we did learn something from it. Here's another example that was not successful. There's an article a couple of years ago in this journal called the Journal of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers by an attorney named Kimberly Joyce. And the name of the article is Under the Microscope, the Admissibility of Parental Alienation Syndrome. So the entire thesis of this article is incorrect. And that it talks about PAS theory, and that it says that I'll show you the problematic sentence here. It says that PAS, parental alienation, is a disorder that excludes other factors that might impact the parent-child relationship and attributes responsibility exclusively to the favored parent. That's a false statement about parental alienation theory. Nobody, no proponent of parental alienation has ever had the idea that we should exclude other factors that might impact the parent-child relationship. So that is a very common misunderstanding about parental alienation theory. And that entire article was based on that misunderstanding. In other words, it wasn't just a paragraph in the article. The entire article was based on the idea that parental alienation automatically assumes that every example of contact refusal is caused by an alienating parent, which is incorrect. So in this case, we sent letters to several different people, and this is our response. I'll tell you ahead of time, this wasn't successful. We didn't get anywhere with this terrible article, which is grossly incorrect. We sent our letters to the author of the article, and she didn't reply at all. We sent it to the editor-in-chief of the journal, who replied, "This journal has published many sides of many debates over many decades. The journal encourages and supports original policy, legal, and social science discussions which relate to the practice of family law." So then the other editor said, "I have nothing further to add." The president of the organization didn't reply. Well, what's wrong with this response? This is what they're saying. This whole discussion is simply a difference of opinion among the writers, and that in many situations, experts disagree on something. But that's not what we're saying. We know that there are times when experts disagree, but what we're saying is that this article has factual mistakes. In other words, this article is misinterpreting and misstating things that have been written by proponents of parental alienation theory. In other words, they're not talking about disagreements of differences of opinion. We're talking about factual errors. And that's a really important distinction to make when you try to correct errors that have been published. But in any case, that was not a successful attempt at correcting misinformation. Here's another attempt that was not successful so far. Here's a book that was published about a year ago. The name of the book is Challenging Parental Alienation, and it's edited by that psychologist I mentioned previously. Her name was Jean Mercer, and by a law professor whose name is Margaret Drew. This is published by a publishing company called Routledge, which actually has published some really, really good books, including books about parental alienation. But in this case, the book called Challenging Parental Alienation has hundreds of false statements about parental alienation theory. So we wrote this up, my colleagues and I wrote this up and published a review of that book. It's called A Comprehensive Review of Misinformation and Other Inaccuracies in the book called Challenging Parental Alienation. So this is also available. If you're interested, you can just put in that title and Google it, and it'll pop up. If it doesn't, you can send me an email, and I will send you this document, which goes into great detail about the inaccuracies in the book. In fact, it's a really good example of how to refute inaccuracies. Well, we've had a back and forth with the publishing people, with Routledge, and they're not doing anything. They say they like the book, that they've had people look at it who thought it was okay, and that they are not even trying to check into the inaccuracies. In other words, we give them many, many examples of misleading or false statements, and they are apparently making no attempt at all to check out the misinformation that we're bringing to their attention. So that was another example that was not successful. Actually, this is what they said. Many thanks for your message regarding this book. And then they say, we checked back through our own records. We can see that the proposal was externally reviewed by experts in the field and received 2 supportive endorsements. Although we appreciate that the field is a contested one, we are happy with the book's content and will not be withdrawing it from sale. So that's their position. So there are a couple of other things that are currently pending, in which we're making complaints about something, but they haven't been completed. So here's a book published a couple of years ago by the American Bar Association, and it's called High Conflict Litigation. Most of this book is very, very good. Most of this book by Benjamin Garber and some other people talks about all the different reasons why a child might not want to see one of their parents. And we agree with about 80% of the book. But the book has one chapter, chapter 15, which has much negative and false information about parental alienation. So we sent a detailed complaint to the American Bar Association. This is the kind of thing that the book says, that they're talking about parental alienation theory, that it reasons that if a child is aligned with parent A and rejecting parent B, and parent B has not been abusive, then de facto parent A must be alienating. Well, we don't believe that. We don't believe that automatically you would conclude that parent A is an alienating parent just because the child doesn't want to see parent B, that you have to be able to show it. And what we would say is that there are many possible reasons why a child might not want to see parent B, and you have to consider all the different reasons. And furthermore, you can't assume that parent A is alienating the child. You have to actually find evidence for that. You have to find specific alienating behaviors that can be identified. So that's our complaint about this book. So far, we've gotten no response from the author. I sent all of our concerns to the author of the book, who did not respond. We sent it to the general counsel of the American Bar Association, who did not respond, and to the president of the ABA. Now, we did get a response from the person who's called the executive editor of book publishing. And he says, our ABA publishing team is committed to upholding the highest standards of accuracy. We make every effort to ensure the information in our books is well researched, and so on. In other words, these are just platitudes. They're saying, oh, we believe in the highest standards, but they're not they're not checking the various examples of misinformation that we send to them, that they're not investigating at all. They're simply saying, well, this seems like a disagreement among experts, but it's not that. It's actual factual errors. So far, that has not been successful. We also are investigating this journal in greater detail, the Journal of Child Custody. I'm not going to tell you all about that right now, but let me explain that my colleague Shenming Zhu and I did publish an article that illustrated a huge amount of misinformation and how it's passed down from one article to another. These are all articles. Each little circle is an article that was published that contains certain misinformation about parental alienation. And then we can put in the lines, and the lines show, those are actually little arrows. They show how the misinformation spread from one article to the next. Now, many of these articles are associated with the same journal. For instance, see all this material in orange? These are the same articles, and these articles were either published in that journal, the Journal of Child Custody, or they were written by one of the editors of that journal. In other words, all of this trail of misinformation seems to be promoted by a specific group of people associated with that journal. So this is a project that we're still working on, and we hope to publish this in a few months. What can we do about all this? Let's talk about some things that you can do, that I can do, that other people can do to address it. First of all, you can make a formal complaint to the publisher. So I told you about that. We complained to Norsted's Juridic and nothing happened. We complained to the American Psychological Association and they did make a correction. Another thing we can do is publish a rebuttal in the same journal. And I gave you several examples of that. The Journal of Apple, the Journal of Forensic Sciences, and some others. If you do this, if you're interested, I encourage you to try writing an article and start with a really good journal. Be prepared that you might get it rejected and you'll have to submit it elsewhere. But they'll send it to peer reviewers and really read the advice of the peer reviewers. Usually it's really, really helpful. When I say make lemonade from lemons, I'm referring to the idea that if somebody publishes a bad article about parental alienation with misinformation, use that as the basis, use that as leverage for why you should be allowed to publish a rebuttal in the same journal. And don't just worry about journals. I think many of the people who are listening to this are not really involved in a sense of being able to send articles to professional journals, but I bet that you can send articles to newsletters that many of these organizations of psychologists, social workers, pediatricians have newsletters, and even attorneys. Almost every bar association of each state has a little journal or a little magazine, and they might welcome an article for their newsletter or their magazine about parental alienation, especially if you write something about your own personal experience, might be very powerful. That's something that you can do. If you do this, don't do it by yourself. Consult with colleagues for feedback regarding your article or your essay. Make presentations at meetings or groups that you belong to and get feedback. You can also get involved if you do have a professional background. You can become part of an editorial board of a journal, and you'll have some influence on what gets published in that journal. Or you can yourself volunteer to do peer reviews, and in doing that, you can they'll send you, the editor will send you an article that's under review, and you can send your opinion. So this is a bigger deal. If you really don't like misinformation, you can write a book And there are several that really attempt to deal with misinformation. This is the book that Demosthenes Larandos and I published a couple of years ago. And each chapter has a discussion of misinformation pertaining to the topic of that chapter. And this is the book that Ashish Joshi published a couple of years ago. And it has an entire chapter on misinformation. So not everybody's going to want to write a book about this topic, but here are a couple of books that you can refer to and take a look at if you want some ideas about how to refute misinformation. Here's what you can do. Don't believe everything you read. Sometimes you have to check the original sources, the original articles way back years ago, to see if they're being quoted correctly or if they're being misrepresented. Write a letter to an editor. You don't have to be a PhD to send a letter to an editor of a newspaper or a journal complaining about an article that's been published. And at times that's been very successful. And that groups of people have done that, and something got turned around. Incidentally, make a video. Everything I've talked about today has to do with writing things, things that are published. But, you know, nowadays, media goes way, way beyond that. And many people have made videos about parental alienation. Well, and there have been a few videos about misinformation. And our colleague Lawrence DeMarco has a website with many of these videos. You might want to look him up. His name is DeMarco, and the name of his website is The Law Center. If you do this, use some of our resources that are already available. Go to our website, the PASG website, has a section on misinformation. Like I said, don't do it by yourself. Get part of a campaign or organize a campaign. As an simple example, a few years ago, the American Psychological Association solicited feedback. They were publishing guidelines for child custody evaluation, and they asked for people to send in suggestions. And many, many people, we kept track of it. At the time, there were about 30 people who sent in feedback and I think had some influence. And the same thing happened with AFCC, the Association of Family and Conciliation Court, that when they're publishing new guidelines, they ask for input. And groups of us have provided input and I believe had influence on the outcome of those documents. So I realize this can be very frustrating. It can make you angry when you see bad information, but there are things you can do. Sometimes they work, a lot of times they work, sometimes they don't work. But a lot of times, especially if you team up with other people, you can have an influence. So I hope that this helps you have ideas about how to understand, how to identify misinformation and what you might do about it. And the wrap up is get published. If you do want to get published, try to be creative. I mentioned both qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research simply refers to writing about your own experience. That's an example of a little personal case report, which is an example of qualitative research. And if you do write something up and get it published, let us know. At PASG, we keep track of these things, and Robert Ferrer keeps track of them, and we have a website, the Parental Alienation Database, that keeps track of things that have been published. Well, is any of this possible to resolve? We need to find common ground. When there are people who disagree with us, rather than just argue with them and debate, we need to find common ground. And we recommended that organizations such as AFCC make that happen. And this is an idea that I had a couple of years ago. Convene a meeting of people who have different perspectives, coordinate it through the AFCC, assign the group of people in the meeting an assignment of putting together something in writing as to how they disagree and how they might disagree. And even more important, if you do this, identify specific research that can sort out the disagreements and then publish the result. My whole point here is that rather than just debate and argue, try to find common ground and try to figure out a way to communicate with people that you're not agreeing with. So this is what I think almost everybody might agree with in my final statement. Domestic violence is a serious problem that affects many families, but sometimes there are false allegations of domestic violence. Parental alienation is a serious problem that affects many families, but sometimes there are false allegations of parental alienation. So rather than debate and argue about all this, put energy into how to tell the difference, how to sort out the difference between true situations of domestic violence and parental alienation and false allegations. I know many of you are interested in parental alienation. You're welcome to join our organization, the Parental Alienation Study Group. These different organizations have somewhat different missions. Family Access is extremely successful in putting on conferences and in creating support opportunities for people, and especially parents and grandparents. PASG has a little bit different mission, and if you're interested, contact us at www.pasg.info. Thank you very much for your attention today, and best wishes.